Well, hello yet again, all you lovely people. We're back. And well, now so far, I hope you have at least a decent sense about what cultural relativism is about. And you can, peruse the Rachels and Rachels. They go into, I think, a pretty fair assessment of what this view involves. So between me and them, I think you should have a handle on this. So now we can transition to think about, well, why do a lot of people, especially anthropologists, seem to really like cultural relativism? They really can get behind the idea that morality is nothing else but based on cultural or social acceptance. And we'll walk through that. But to get us started, I would like to just show a few examples. So I've popped up here some Japanese characters because I'll say this one. I've had so many of my Japanese friends try to help me pronounce this word, and I just get it wrong every bloody time. Okay, so I'll say it once, and then you can laugh if you know Japanese, and then we can move on. Sugigiri literally means crossroad cutting or crossroads cutting. And I'll explain what this crossroad cutting is, this sugigiri. There, I said it really quick, so you couldn't even hear it. So bad, I'm sorry. Now, this is a Japanese verb, and it means to try out one's new sword on a chance wayfarer. Because the idea is that when a samurai had a new sword, a samurai had to be able to do a proper, because I don't know if you've seen movies, but when the samurai would run into battle, they would just be like chopping through people, because they had to basically dispatch a person with one hit, just literally cut them. Oh man, I spit everywhere, sorry. Just literally one stroke, just cleave the person from shoulder to flank with one hit, because they had to move on to keep doing it to other, the enemy soldiers. But when he had a new sword, the worry was this new sword good enough? Would it be able to, do that one nice slice? Because if in a battle, if your sword broke or wasn't sharp enough, that would be a very grave dishonor to the samurai. And so the idea or the cultural practice, now this is really a long time. Trust me, Japan is safe now. They do not do this anymore. Let me just warn you. This was outlawed, I think, in like the 1609 or something. So it's been illegal for a very long time. But in feudal Japan, a long time ago, what would happen is that often at night, if a samurai came upon just some, as it says, a chance wayfarer, just some other person, traveling on the roads, and if the samurai came across this person, they might just decide, oh, I guess I should try out my sword on this random person here. And usually a peasant or a merchant, and would just would kill this person, cut him in half to make sure their sword worked properly so that it wouldn't be embarrassed during battle. And the only real rule is that a samurai could not do it to another samurai. That was the only rule. Otherwise, you could try out your sword, again, on just a random person, a chance wayfarer. And so that's one cultural practice. I'm going to throw up some pictures here of an old Indian. Again, old Indian, they don't do this anymore. This was made illegal, I forget when now. I want to say a little more recently, but not maybe 30, 40 years ago. I'd have to look it up. But this is the practice of sati. This is the practice of sacrificing a widow at her husband's funeral. This could be by burning her on her husband's funeral pyre. They're burning the body, and the widow, the wife, goes on that pyre as well and is burned to death with the body. Or it could also, I believe, happen in other cases where the woman would be, the wife, the widow, would be buried alive with her husband's body. So in either case, the practice of sacrificing the widow at her husband's funeral. So these are all social practices, none of which are currently practiced in the world, I hope, today, at least certainly not common if they are, rare or don't exist at all. So again, we've seen this practice of the crossroads cutting by the samurai, no longer legal. And then finally, the practice of suti, the sacrifice of the widow on her husband's funeral pyre. Again, practices that once were historically done, but not today. My question to you all is can we criticize these practices? Because I think we might have an impulse, small or big, to say, wow, that's messed up. I'm glad that's not done anymore. These seem to be pretty harmful, especially to the poor and vulnerable, whether it's the women, the wives, or that poor random vulnerable person walking at night through the crossroads. But some people think still, that's what they did back then, and so it was fine for them. Come on, we kind of need to have an open mind and shouldn't be so critical of cultural practices that are, different from our own. Because, and of course, cultural relativism agrees. It says, look, we can't criticize them because morality is determined by the customs and laws of one's own society. So as Professor Gray, as an American, can't criticize the feudal Japanese or the Indian practices, the Indians who were practicing suti. How can I, as an American, I can't, because I'm from a different society and culture. Who am I to criticize them for this? And now anthropologists like Ruth Benedict think this is a very good position to have. I mean, they are very concerned about an ethical imperialism where, say, an American, for instance, takes their ideas about ethics and morality and imposes this morality on different peoples and different cultures, which, of course, is often done through force and violence. After all, what was colonialism but the imposition of alien values on a native people? And so cultural relativism is supposed to be the exact opposite of this violent ethical imperialism. Cultural relativism is supposed to be open-minded appreciation of different cultures and societies and not judging them as inferior or backwards or anything like that. This is supposed to be about peaceful coexistence, the exact opposite of imperialism. And Ruth Benedict definitely comes from that school. I mean, I won't go into it, but if you read about her, maybe even on Wikipedia, I don't know. If you read about her life, you might start to see why she would have been very keen to show how what seems strange in other cultures is perfectly normal in that culture. And indeed, those other right, with her example, she says repeatedly is that us a modern day, say like Professor Gray would look like the crazy one if I was in these native tribes in the Pacific Northwest. I would be the crazy one, and whereas I might look at them and say, wow, these people are kind of weird. These practices seem strange. They would look at me and I'm the outsider, the weird one. I'm the abnormal one, according to them. And so this is where Ruth Benedict then has this bold conclusion towards the end of her paper, where she says quite blatantly, morality differs in every society and is a convenient term for socially approved habits. Hey, that's cultural relativism. Morality is nothing but socially approved habits. That's just another way of saying morality depends on one's society or culture, and that's it. That's all there is to it. So now how does she defend this claim? Because she has this whole paper, and you can look at it and see, well, what does she talk about in this? It's a little lengthy paper. I mean, a little long, because I think these are lots of interesting stories she has to tell, some of which might even be downright chilling. And they're like, wow, I can't believe people did this. That's kind of scary. But she's an example. She uses lots of examples because she is an anthropologist. She's not a philosopher. She is an anthropologist. And so she provides lots of examples from her research into the indigenous peoples, again, of the Pacific Northwest coast. And there she finds all sorts of practices and customs that probably to us seem incredibly strange or even abnormal, she says. And so I'll try to say this name again because this is the tribe she spends most of the time talking about, the Kukutil. Oh man, I'm sorry. I'll put it down at the bottom. But this is the tribe she talks about, and she talks about their bereavement traditions. That is, when someone dies in this indigenous culture, what do these people do? And if you read it, it's pretty kind of scary. They go find strangers and murder them. They talk about, the chief's son died, and so they went and found these strangers and killed them, including their children. And the idea was as though the people they killed and their families, they too now have something to mourn. And she goes into all sorts of explanations about why that seems perfectly normal to this indigenous tribe, this indigenous people. But of course, it makes perfect sense to them. And she'd say if we told them not to do that, they would think we're the crazy ones. Because we're the abnormal ones. And so she is trying to say a lot of, again, is that what's normal and abnormal is really relative to societies, depending on what society you're in. And then she extends that to all of morality itself. Morality itself is based on one's society and culture. But notice here what Benedict's research is doing. She's providing us what she thinks are clear examples of the truth to cultural conventionalism. Remember, cultural conventionalism was the descriptive or factual claim that different societies have different ideas about what's right and wrong. And Benedict's evidence, if she did the anthropology correct, I don't know if this is all true or not. Anthropology is tricky. Sometimes people tell you things that they just make up. So I don't know if this is, I'm not an expert on these tribes or these peoples, but if they're true, she is definitely providing evidence to support cultural conventionalism, the descriptive claim about morality. And notice, that's it. That's her argument. It's a pretty easy argument diagram to draw because she's from this cultural conventionalism, these differences that her studies in anthropology reveal, she then just concludes with cultural relativism. She says, look, hey, different cultures have different moral codes. That's cultural conventionalism. And then she uses that to directly support the truth of cultural relativism. But at the end of the day, that's all there is. Morality is itself relative to one's society or culture. There's nothing more to say about morality than what your society or culture says about it. And Rachel's call this the cultural differences argument. And they aren't very impressed by this argument. They think it's got a pretty big, one very big problem. And what they do is they say, hey, let's assess the soundness of this argument. Do you need to go back and review that video about what validity and soundness were? You can run back quick and come back and see me. Okay, so they're going to talk about soundness. And recall that soundness asks us to do two things, or it asks two questions. The first question is, are the premises true? And the second question is the argument valid? Are the premises true? Is the argument valid? If we answer yes to both of those, the argument is sound. If we answer no to any or both of them, then the argument is not sound. Okay, well, this argument only has one premise, thank heavens. Whew. So we only have one thing to check for, are the premises true? And as I've mentioned, it at least seems pretty true that different societies have different moral codes. That doesn't seem to be too controversial. But maybe I'll just get you to think about something on your own and just give you some thoughts to think about, is that are these cultures so different after all? I mean, they might on the surface look very different. I think we might think about, say, the Eskimos, who at one point in their history would often let their elders go out onto the ice floe and die. And today we think that's kind of cruel. Why don't we just send our elders to Florida to retire? But the Eskimos did that. We might say, well, why did the Eskimos do that? Because that seems really different from our practices. And then we might learn, well, there's not a lot of food when you live up that far north. And there was a concern that if you're not able to bring in food or support the community, that we have to let you go because otherwise we'll all die, trying to say. And we might say, look, that's cruel logic, but at least it makes sense insofar as it's being done out of the protection of the community. And indeed, if we took one of those Eskimos and brought them into today's society, and indeed, there are Eskimos today, and I'll just tell you right now, Eskimos, I'm pretty sure, aren't killing their elders. No, they're sending their elders to Florida or wherever to retire. Or they're like, well, we don't have to hunt for these animals now. We can just go to the grocery store, so we can feed grandma. Okay, we don't have to set grandma and grandpa out on an ice floe to die. And the whole point is that the rationale behind it was the safety of their group, but they can protect themselves without having to sacrifice their elders now. And I'm sure that's what happens now. I'm pretty sure they're not sending out their elders to die. And so my point is simply is at the end of the day, we might have common values. Like if things look different, we might dig deeper and find more commonalities. And indeed, I'm going to say this because this surprised me when I heard this. So I'm going to say, I don't know what I think about this example, but it was said to me and it really kind of shook me because I taught this class to a group of Arab students in the Middle East, many times, in fact. And one group, when I did this, they read Ruth Benedict's article, and then I was telling them about this wild practice that the Kutil have when it comes to, murdering, when they're sad at the loss of a loved one, they go out and murder innocent people to restore balance or show their manlyhood or whatever it was that Benedict thought it was. And my students turned to me and said, well, doesn't America do that too? And I'm like, what are you talking about? No, we don't. And they said, well, after 9/11, America as a country seemed to be going through stages of grief. And they responded to 9/11 by invading other countries. And a lot of innocent people died as a result of that. And I admit that shook me. So I'm like, holy cow. we like to think of ourselves far different from this indigenous tribe and how they mourn the loss of their loved ones. And yet, maybe we do the same thing. At least that's what certainly these students thought. Again, I don't know what I think about this. It's just something that shook me, and maybe you guys can think about that, is that, yeah, maybe things that look so different to us, we have around too. We just don't notice it or talk about it for whatever reason. But also that shook me. That shook me like nothing else, because I was like, I had never thought about it that way before. Anyway, I'll leave it to you to decide if cultures are really that different or not. At the very least, you might think that there does seem to be at least some differences. So we don't have to throw out all of Ruth Benedict's research. Okay, so the premises might very well be true. It's just not crazy, at least. So perhaps then Benedict's argument passes the first test of soundness. Are the premises true? They seem that they very well could be true, at least. And again, I'll let you decide if you disagree with that or not. But then we have to go to the second step now then. Is the argument valid? Now recall the old video about that. Remember, validity just says, well, let's assume that the premises are true just for the sake of argument. But does that mean that the conclusion must also be true? That is to say, let's assume that the premises are true and then see if the conclusion must, logically follow from that. So let's go back to our cultural differences argument, and for the sake of argument, let's just assume that cultural conventionalism is true. The different societies have different moral codes. But does the conclusion of cultural relativism immediately follow from that and that alone? Rachels and Rachels say no. They say that even if cultural conventionalism is true, it is still possible that cultural relativism is false. So again, assume for the sake of argument, cultural conventionalism, the descriptive claim, is true. But do we get then that bold, normative, meta-ethical claim about morality? And they say they don't think that happens. And well, why is that? And they have a pretty simple argument, nothing too fancy. They just say, it's one thing to descriptively say what people believe about something, but it's another thing to go from what people believe to what is the actual truth. Or to put it differently, just because people disagree about something, does that mean then we have to conclude that there isn't a truth about that thing? And they give a simple example, Rachels and Rachels do, about the Earth. They say, well, imagine that half of the world's population thinks the Earth is flat, and the other half of the Earth's population thinks the planet is round. Okay, well, we disagree about whether the Earth's flat or round, but there's still a truth about it. It's still possible that one of the groups is wrong. And it turns out if you're a flat earther, there are people like that. The blue Earth's flat. You're wrong. Sorry. No, the Earth's round. So just because people disagree about something, it doesn't mean that everyone's right. It could be that they're both wrong, or one group's right, one group's wrong, or whatever. But relativism is a much bolder claim. Remember, relativism says, well, people disagree. Different societies have different codes. Therefore, we conclude there is no objective morality. It's all relative to one's culture. And so this is laying a breadcrumb, a clue for something we'll come back at the end of this week's modules, that the idea is that maybe there is still truth that can be discovered. Maybe. We've seen that with the Earth and whether it's flat or round, but maybe there's also a truth that can be found about morality. And we're just disagreeing about it today because, we're human, we're finite, we make mistakes. And so similarly in ethics, then, just to tie a bow around this, is just because people disagree about something does not automatically imply that we just have to give up and say it's all relative to culture. So the idea of what Rachels and Rachels are saying is, if you want to defend cultural relativism, the bold, meta-ethical, normative claim about the nature of morality itself, we need more than just a descriptive fact that people tend to disagree from different cultures about the nature of morality. We need more than simple descriptive facts. We need something stronger. Benedict and the anthropologists don't give us that. They're anthropologists. So of course, what they're doing is descriptive. They're describing what different societies believe. And that's great. Different societies believe all sorts of stuff. But just because they disagree in their beliefs isn't enough to give us relativism. We need something else. And so this doesn't destroy cultural relevance. All we've said is that this cultural difference argument is wrong. Now, there might be other arguments out there that are better. And I'm sure there are better arguments. But this is why then Rachel's and Rachel say, well, what we're going to do instead is just show why you probably shouldn't accept cultural relativism, period. And that's what we'll talk about in my next video, the final video for this unit. I know, woo, culture, it's fun. No? Okay, I enjoy it. So take a stretch of the legs, listen to some music, have a cup of tea. If you smoke, smoke. You shouldn't smoke, but I'm not your mom. So do what you need to do to decompress for a moment, then we can come back and wrap this up by seeing some serious accusations, serious problems that Rachel's and Rachel say that cultural relativism has. All right, I'll see you back here in a moment.